The idea of using bibliometrics for the review meant that we were doing so in a very objective fashion. So what we did was, number one, with the assistance of the library, we developed a way of capturing all the research output of the school electronically, and then we were able to find out how often the publications were cited. So we measured publication output and publication impact, and those two metrics were very useful to us because all the staff were being assessed along the same criteria. And what was probably the most important thing of all was that this was being done by an outside unit, namely the library, because there would always be some natural suspicion among academics if one member of staff were leading a project which involved assessing other members of staff using some kind of index. There would be some suspicion about that naturally. So it was great to have the library on hand to advise us on the best tools for doing this. I think the staff were extremely happy to have, first of all, an external person, the people from research services, just providing a seminar on how to measure the impact of your research, which was really useful. That was the first thing. But the second reason that it was helpful to have the library involved was when it came to the calculation of H indices and of research citations, it meant that one person, or a group of 3 people in this case, was doing all the work externally, and so it was being done in the same way. The negative side, slightly, was that because psychology is a subject that involves books and book chapter publications as well as journal articles, and because the bibliometric tools we used were fundamentally based on journal articles, it meant that some members of staff were a little bit dismayed to find that their output was being edited a little bit in line with the bibliometric tool. So we did have discussions about this, and in fact many of the staff who contributed book chapters and books were actually, I suppose, underrepresented in the final impact, and the final citation count. But that's just one of the hazards of using bibliometric tools, and we were aware of that from the very beginning. I think that bibliometric tools have a great value in measuring change, and in our case in psychology, what we found was, with the help of the research services from the library, we found a metric called impact relative to subject area. And this was a new one on me, but it showed that you can compare different schools from different institutions in their impact in a particular subject area. And why we found that especially helpful was that UCD aspires to belong to one of the top research groups in the UK, namely the Russell Group of universities. And with the help of the Insights database offered by the research services of the library, we were able to measure the output and impact of psychology publications relative to the Russell Group, which is the top 20 UK universities. And we found that over a 10-year period, we had gone from something like 17th to 8th in that top 20. So even though we're not members of the group, using the impact relative to subject area index, we had a hypothetical place, and we could see how that place had changed from 17th to 8th over a 5 to 10 year span. And that is something you can talk about, but when you see it proved on paper using a metric, then I think it's really a great boost to the morale of the school. So we found that a really helpful outcome from using bibliometrics. It's an interesting question to look at bibliometric tools on a sort of personal basis. One obvious way in which that's being done at the moment, and I see this all the time, is people citing their career H index, which gives a measure of the impact of or how many times the person has been cited. I would encourage all PhD students to become familiar with the different personal bibliometric tools, because it helps to document these when you're applying for a job, for example. But there are pros and cons of all of that. So for instance, we found that the H index is not influenced by a particular paper that's been cited a lot, whereas the G index might be influenced in that way. So you learn to choose different types of tools depending upon what message you're trying to convey. So I think the lesson is that bibliometrics can be very useful, but you do have to know quite a lot about it before you decide which tool is best for you. But I think more and more research is being quantified, and we are, I suppose, obliged as researchers to learn to use tools that best document the impact of our work. Now, the big challenge for the future, of course, is what they call social validation, which is how often our work has been used to transform or change policy in different areas. And I don't know how successful bibliometrics is going to be in producing an index to measure that variable. With the advice from the library, we were able to develop a methodology that we think is very reliable and robust. And very simply what it does is, first of all, we captured all the publication output of the school. And then the next question is, how do you represent or display that for ease of comprehension? So what we did was we developed a strategy whereby we divided the school into 4 research groups, and within each research group we calculated the research output in terms of publications of that group, and we put that in a diagram. And along with that we calculated the impact of that publication output. So we calculated the number of citations of the cumulative output. And then the third thing we did in the diagram was we put a range of H indices of the researchers involved. The point about that was it meant that every single member of the staff of the school who contributed to that group felt involved, because their H index may be relatively low, perhaps 3, 2, 3, whatever it was, but it was part of the group from 3 to maybe 11 or 12, and so everybody felt involved, everybody contributed, and the diagram that resulted enabled the examiners at a glance to look at the strengths and impact of the research output of a school in a single diagram. And we added another aspect to the diagram, which is a qualitative dimension, namely the top 10 journals in which members of staff of that research group published. So you could see that measure involved quantitative and qualitative indices fitted on a single graph and allowed every member of the school to contribute in a sensible and valid way.